In preparing for tonight's event, it's 67 years basically since the occupation ended, and yet in France the residue of that experience continues to this day. So very graciously, Stefan was happy to post the flyer in the hotel, but you'll notice that the Pétain flag and the Hakenkreuz have been buffed out. God forbid somebody who spoke French would see this and not get a sense of what it's all about. So that sensibility remains. 67 years after the fact, and it still persists in the ways I think, to some degree, I think the Germans have confronted it. They may never get over it. They're probably tired of being blamed for everything forever. Robert Paxton's epic work will be available for sale, as will Alan Riding's work. No discussion of the occupation in France can begin without Robert Paxton. The discussion, the debate exists in what we know as Bépée and Appé, which is before Paxton and after Paxton. And this work completely changed the way in which this discussion took place. Simultaneous, or almost simultaneous, with the publication of this book was largely through the efforts of François Truffaut. La Chagrin et la Pitié, The Sorrow and the Pity, found its way to French television and then eventually internationally. I was just remarking that on Sunday in preparation I rewatched La Combe Lucien, Louis Malle's film from 1974. Michel Drac had a film called Le Violon du Bal, and Lozi did a phenomenal film largely funded by Alain Delon called Monsieur Klein. And all these began to really dig very, very deep. And they're not melodramatic, they're highly nuanced, and very much a part of what I would call the canon. But it begins and ends with Paxton's book. I was interviewing Jean-Paul Rapneau, the film director, in relation to a film called Bon Voyage, which was the final days at the Hotel Splendide in Bordeaux, where the government had begun to move. And in this gigantic dining room, on one side of the room you had Maréchal Pétain and Charles de Gaulle, who the following day would leave for England. There's a little bit of like a Feydeau farce in which he described it as being that. But I had mentioned Ophel's work, and he said, but the greatest authority is Robert Paxton. Robert Paxton, will you join us, please? Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
So, does this mic really work or not?
No, speak loud.
I'll just speak loud. Okay. Alan Riding and I work the same fields, so to speak, and this should be his evening because he's written this marvelous book, and the band played on about how intellectuals, artists, writers, and so forth responded to the defeat and the occupation. And I worked a long time ago on how the government, the political class, responded to the defeat and the occupation. And I was fantastically lucky. I was just a country boy from Virginia, and I lucked into this subject. And a classmate told me about the German archives. The Germans kept very complete records of what they were doing in this country. And there are also American archives, because though it's controversial, we had an ambassador here until April 1942, a very prominent one, personal friend of Roosevelt, Admiral Leahy. And until November 42, we had he went home. He was called home when Laval returned to power in April 42. But there remained an embassy, and there remained military attachés. Those reports went back to Washington. I talked to so-and-so today, and he said the following. And those documents, which haven't been tampered with, are just fantastically interesting and useful because, believe me, the memoirs written after the war have been tampered.
Approaches to the same subject. One of them is a city is occupied by a foreign power. In this case, occupied is probably the right word, not conquered, because there really wasn't a fight. And this wasn't, shall we say, any city. It wasn't even Warsaw, it wasn't Brussels, it wasn't Amsterdam, it was Paris, the jewel of European culture that had been during the 20s and 30s above all, but even from the late 19th century, the center of, shall we say, Western culture, drawing artists and writers and intellectuals from around, even from the United States, the lost generation, as you know, but also the great artists from all over, the Picassos and the Miros and those who came from Eastern Europe. So Paris was this extraordinary place which, in a way, had intimidated the Germans for probably 2 or 3 centuries. In French classicism is something that the Germans spent their lives trying to fight against. Interestingly, going back to another period, but that the Germans adopted Shakespeare a long time before the French would have anything to do with him, because Shakespeare was anti-French classicism, and he did it his own way. And so the Germans thought, this is great, we can fight the Germans, fight the French on that. The French, by the way, when they translated Shakespeare, they turned him into Racine, and they made it all at the very beginning.